The Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice Ultimate Edition is Zack Snyder's director's cut, which includes 30 minutes of extra footage, bringing the total duration to 182 minutes, over 3 hours. Whereas the theatrical cut felt like its original duration, the Ultimate Edition feels much shorter than its actual duration, therefore is more engaging. The Ultimate Edition is what should have been released theatrically. The theatrical cut was the nail in the coffin for some of Snyder's critics regarding his future in the DC Extended Universe, but the Ultimate Edition shows what Snyder's true vision was. The Ultimate Edition is an artist's film, the theatrical cut was a studio's film. Anyone who's been critical of Snyder in the past owes it to themselves to see the Ultimate Edition in order to judge Snyder by a film that wasn't a compromise with studio executives. The theatrical cut felt as if the story were missing scenes, many of which existed in isolation with no context between them. The Ultimate Edition restores what should have been there and exposes the theatrical cut for what the theatrical cut is, an incoherent mess of story. Reports of executives giving an early screening a standing ovation raised expectations for the theatrical cut, but ultimately it didn't live up to that hype. I can only say, having seen both cuts, that the Ultimate Edition is likely to be the cut which created this initial response. While the story is more detailed, the story is also still the same. Any flaws in the theatrical cut are also present in the Ultimate Edition, but the Ultimate Edition's story flows more consistently, making those flaws less noticeable or more forgivable in their new context. The main reason for this is characters being more developed, giving the story more depth and those characters' motivations more clear. Alexander Luthor's plan makes only the same amount of sense as originally, but how each character involved discovers the truth is explained with more clarity, making their final actions in the climax more believable. This is the Ultimate Edition's greatest strength. Everything that happens has more context, improving the story as a whole. The difference between the theatrical cut and the Ultimate Edition can be perfectly summed up with comparison to Richard Donner. A director on his second Superman film is screwed over by Warner Bros. Pictures, who release an inferior theatrical cut, missing key moments that aren't seen by the people who care the most until the original cut is released on home media. Is considered much better than what we ended up with the first time. Good McNary's Wallace Keith is no longer a plot device but a character. Whether Wallace intended to testify against Clark Kent or was exploited by Alexander, or whether those actions were Wallace's own doing, was never elaborated upon in the theatrical cut. In the Ultimate Edition, there's a key scene that solves this puzzle, and what's revealed makes Wallace a more likeable character in terms of development and how Wallace fits into the story being told. It's small details being paid off like this that reinforces what the theatrical cut wasn't, but should have been. Like Alexander Jr. having a more developed backstory involving his relationship with Alexander Sr. and how that led to Alexander Jr.'s current perception of deities, making Alexander Jr.'s skepticism of Clark's neutrality part of a developed character, and not dialogue that sounds interesting for the sake of being interesting. Henry Cavill's version of Clark is more likeable as well. This version of the Clark alias has been criticised by some for not being different enough from the Superman alias, the only difference being glasses. The Ultimate Edition inserts small cuts from the people around Clark that builds the character on their own. Cavill's Clark doesn't need to act in the way that Christopher Reeve's Clark did, because that perception is already there. All of this makes Clark sacrifice the end of a character arc rather than an excuse to adapt the Death of Superman arc, particularly the extended cut of the scene in which Clark meets Jonathan Kent in a dream sequence and realises that every action has consequences, that the only true selfless act is an act of sacrifice. Once again, Jonathan is the emotional core of a Superman film. The Ultimate Edition is what should have been released theatrically. Its 182-minute duration could have easily been divided into two 91-minute films, Batman vs Superman and Dawn of the Justice League. The two halves do feel like two separate acts of a story, but the Ultimate Edition makes that story more cohesive. Had the Ultimate Edition been exhibited as two films, there'd have probably been a better critical response overall. For instance, the sequence in Africa at the beginning is longer and establishes more details that, get this, have a payoff. Considering this sequence is the trigger for the story and the reason the world decides to act on its suspicion of the Superman, this says a lot. This scene in particular is the Ultimate Edition's main improvement over the theatrical cut. The Ultimate Edition doesn't feel rushed. This means that not only are characters more developed, but so too are their relationships. The relationship between Bruce Wayne and Alfred Pennyworth is no longer a vehicle for ideologies. There's a history between them that was only present theatrically due to its presence in the source material. Bruce's career is also built upon in a way that wasn't before. Overall, this makes the third act more well structured because the characters' actions are extensions of their journey instead of being triggers for yet more action. The Doomsday battle thus becomes more coherent because the characters involved feel like people and not live action versions of illustrated characters. That's why it matters that Clark is shown to deduce the truth about Bruce, because it builds on their shared experience that becomes relevant in the final scene. Bruce being inspired by Clark's example to found the Justice League feels like an organic decision rather than blatant franchise setup. Bruce and Clark have come to understand each other, like when Clark visits Gotham and learns about the standard of living compared to Metropolis, and thus learns further context to Bruce's actions as the Batman. The Ultimate Edition is the version I'll be re-watching simply because it feels more like a story than compared to the theatrical cut. Clark is more developed and Bruce is more developed, which is the most important element of a film featuring Batman v Superman as its main title. Ultimate Edition isn't just some marketing gimmick. comic. It's an objective statement, and is thus the only edition or cut that should exist. The theatrical cut expected me to care about Martha on the basis of Martha being a character I knew from the comics, but the Ultimate Edition realises that doing something creative with a character I know, rather than just including a character I know, is more impressive. The Ultimate Edition would have grossed more. The theatrical edition grossed $900 million. Had the theatrical cut been a better film, word of mouth would have been wider, critics' scores would have been higher, more people would have bought tickets, and Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice could have been the highest grossing film of all time. Clark and Bruce are the two most iconic characters ever created. Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster, Bob Kane, Bill Finger. Artists ahead of their time. The legacy they inspired. Grant Morrison, Frank Miller, Alan Moore. Generation after generation of storyteller adding to the mythos and all helping to prove the power of well-written characters in well-told stories. Audiences deserved for Clark and Bruce's first on-screen encounter to be better. The Ultimate Edition being reserved for home media is a cinematic tragedy, because the Ultimate Edition is not just a better film, but an all-around masterpiece of the motion picture industry. If you don't like that Bruce was a psychotic killer, those scenes are still present, but there are also other scenes to do a better job of establishing how unstable he is, which means the Ultimate Edition isn't what the theatrical cut did, which was to completely ignore the fundamentals of the character, but to at least acknowledge that something new is being tried. If you still don't like how Bruce is a murderer, that's understandable, but you can at least respect the Ultimate Edition for trying, which couldn't be said for the theatrical cut. The theatrical cut was a film about Bruce being a psychopath hell-bent on destroying Clark. The Ultimate Edition is a film about Clark trying to find his place in the world, with his involvement with Bruce eventually leading him to an answer. Plus, the setup for future films feels more natural. Cameos from Bartholomew Allen, Victor Stone and Arthur Curry are still present, but in a story that works better overall. The communion scene released online is presented naturally within that story and explains how Alexander Jr. possesses an understanding of Steppenwolf, making the prophesied events of Justice League less of a franchise moment and more of a story moment. In fact, a good idea would be to wait until maybe the week before Justice League is released to watch the Ultimate Edition, which will refresh your memory of events leading up to Justice League, but in a way that shows what Zack Snyder is capable of achieving if only allowed to. Hopefully, the overwhelmingly positive response to the Ultimate Edition will lead to Snyder having more influence over what's screened, which could be what Justice League needs. Now all we need is David Ayer's cut of Suicide Squad, which was mutilated by, of all people, a trailer editing company, and for Wonder Woman to not suck. Oh dear.